In a small southeastern corner of Britain lies Romney Marsh. Once a self-governing state, the marsh has often been romanticised through literature and art, and historically is the subject of invasions, national defence, and a flourishing smuggling trade. Today, however, this often windswept plain is a peaceful, flat land enjoying rural life and a successful farming industry. Shaped by history and the sea, the marsh has lain at the mercy of the forces of nature and man for thousands of years, and now covers a triangular area of approximately 24,000 acres, bordered by the English Channel, Wee Wall, and the Royal Military Canal, under the protection of surrounding hills. These hills mark an ancient coastline, as the marsh was originally a series of small sandy islands dotted across the estuary of the River Limmen, now called the River Rother. Over time, the receding sea has gifted beautiful flat plains to the higher grounds, creating a unique countryside. The distinctive character of Romney Marsh is due to its labyrinths of lanes and ditches crossing large open fields. Known locally as sewers, these ditches are, in part, the reason why this small section of coastal land has survived. For much of the marsh lies below sea level, and thanks to hardy seawall defences and drainage, the area, rich in alluvial soil, provides an excellent grazing ground for the Romney sheep, for which it is famous. Although many Romneys still inhabit the marsh, diverse other quality crops are now grown, creating the mainstay of local agriculture. The lookers' huts, which were once inhabited by sheep herders, are now disused relics in open fields. The ancient Romney adage, "Serve God, honour the king, but first maintain the wall," is the essence by which the marsh folk have lived for centuries. Although the maintenance of the sea wall, and hence the preservation of the land, was paramount in the lives of the marsh population, the defence of the realm was also of utmost importance. For Romney Marsh lies on the closest section of mainland Britain to the European continent, creating an important invasion coastline. The first recorded invader was Caesar, who in 53 BC landed at Port Lim and built his fort, Stutfall Castle, on one of the hills above the town. As Roman rule ended, the Saxons invaded the area, building many churches and settlements, making significant changes to the landscape. Their work was hindered on many occasions by the Danes, who raped and pillaged the countryside, destroying churches and villages. During the first millennium, Romney Marsh began to flourish. An increase in wool and salt demands meant that coastal towns such as New Romney, which now lies inland, became bustling ports and epicenters for import and export. The local population began to strengthen the sea defences and mudding out the creeks to make drainage channels. After the Norman invasion in the 11th century, more of the marsh was drained and inned, thanks to the efforts of the church and various existing manors. Many of the churches were rebuilt, and because the land was fertile and the villages heavily populated, the building work was financed by big tax revenues imposed by the church, which is the reason why large Norman churches, such as St. George's in Ivychurch, dot the Marsh's flat landscape amidst small villages. However, the collecting of money and materials for sea defence and marsh drainage was not always easy. And so in 1252, King Henry III granted a royal charter giving 24 elected jurats of the Marsh, known as the Corporation of Romney Marsh, full powers to collect the water rates, or scots as they were known, in order to help pay for the ongoing marsh drainage and seawall maintenance. The term scot-free probably comes from this time, and was applied to those living on the uplands, who were exempt from this tax. King Edward IV granted a further charter in 1462, not only to the jurats, but also to the 23 owners of marsh manors, known as the Lords of the Level. These lords elected a bailiff, who together with the jurats were responsible for law and order and local government, in addition to the sea defences. This charter also exempted the marsh dwellers from paying taxes to the Crown and government. The lords and bailiff were given the powers to erect a courthouse, gallows, and prison at their headquarters in Dymchurch. The original courthouse was destroyed by fire in the 16th century, but New Hall was built in its place soon afterwards, and still stands together with part of the jail, the jailer's cottage, the expenditors' and clerks' houses. The sea wall has always been the main concern of marshmen, and bylaws from around this time obligated landowners to plant and provide the blackthorn bushes, which are so much a feature of the marsh scene today. This thorn was cut, bundled, driven into the sea wall, and sealed with mud and turf. So integral was the thorn bush to the sea wall, it was said that if you cut a blackthorn bush without permission, you were liable to have your ear cut off. With the introduction of the wool tax began the smuggling trade. Contraband goods exchanged for wool and other local produce were imported from France and its neighbouring countries, securing a trading partnership between the Marsh and the continent. Many shipments were landed on the sloping beaches of Dymchurch and Littlestone in the dead of night, and the Marsh soon became renowned for this illicit trade. The legendary horsemen and smugglers have often been romanticised through literature, although it's worth remembering they plied a real and dangerous trade. Tried in the old court in Dymchurch, those convicted were hung on the gallows outside the courthouse, although later felons were deported to the colonies. Even as late as 1824, an Edward Pantry was sentenced to death for sheep stealing, but his sentence was commuted to exile for life. The towns of New Romney and Hythe were two of the original Cinque Ports, 5 ports chosen by the monarchy to build and provide ships in times of war. This undertaking by the Cinque Ports is just one example of the region's part in protecting the realm. Romney Marsh has continuously played an important part in national defence over the ages, and today exhibits prime examples of the defence construction of yesteryear. During the Napoleonic Wars, large towers were erected on the shoreline, known as Martello Towers, and with 74 along the southeastern coast of the country, these were the first line of defence against invasion. Manned by troops, many recruited from the Marsh population, and armed with cannons, these towers were never used in action. As the second line of defence, the Royal Military Canal was dug across the Marsh from Hythe to Rye. This 30 feet wide waterway now marks the northern boundary. Although it was never crossed, the waterway was installed with lookout posts at every turn. However, this feat of engineering didn't go to waste, as the canal was later used for the transportation of goods and people servicing the Marsh villages. It now serves as an important drainage channel, discharging its water into the sea at Hythe and the Rother at Rye. During the Second World War, defence presence was high, and consequently much building work was carried out in this area during this time. However, the most notable and long-lasting change to the landscape was the introduction of agriculture. Much of the original grazing ground was ploughed and planted with corn and roots to meet the nation's demands. Thanks to the Marsh's near-perfect agricultural conditions, the crops flourished, and their cultivation has now become one of the region's main livelihoods. It is thanks to the corporation that this fine soil has been preserved and improved, for its longest and most important duty was the protection of the land by the sea wall and effective drainage systems. Today, high waters on the Marsh are controlled by electric pumps, which prevent the ditches from overflowing. These advanced water controls not only act as flood defences, but are adequate deterrents against disease, such as marsh ague, a type of malaria which was common to the Marsh folks in bygone times. The corporation of lords, bailiff and jurats of Romney Marsh, having relinquished its powers of justice to the government and drainage responsibilities to local authorities, still exists today. The election of the bailiff and 24 jurats and the grand Lathe meeting held annually at Whitsun continue traditions in place since the corporation's foundation in 1252. The corporation has created a new role for itself in the preservation of the traditions of the Marsh and maintenance of its historic properties, which include the old court and meeting rooms in New Hall, now opened as a museum to the public. And as far as the marshland is concerned, with a helping hand from man, the seawall and drainage systems will protect and preserve this ancient ground for centuries to come.